In talking about the U.S. leadership and influence with regard to refugee policy, I started the paper looking at some of the factors that have influenced the exercise of U.S. leadership. When has the U.S. engaged fully in refugee issues in a manner in which it wants to exercise its power? Because that doesn't always happen. Certainly, when there's a very strong foreign policy linkage to a particular crisis, the U.S. has been much more likely to engage in a variety of different ways. But because of the way in which the U.S. government operates, both in terms of the executive branch, but also the relationships with Congress, which I'll get to in a minute, that only usually those situations with the strong foreign policy linkages usually only result in strong refugee policy leadership when there's a clear humanitarian need. Because refugee policy has historically been a bipartisan area of policy formulation within the United States. That's eroding a bit as it is with almost every other area of public policy today, but there's still very strong interest on the part of both Democrats and Republicans in having the U.S. play a leadership role. It's facilitated in a third respect when there are strong domestic constituency interests at work that support the exercise of U.S. leadership. And we've seen this historically, for example, in the U.S. leadership on the Indochina refugee crisis throughout decades of interaction because of the strong constituency on it. Congressional backing of presidential decisions is extremely important, and I frame it in that way because unlike other aspects of U.S. immigration policy, the U.S. Executive branch, the president, has a lot more authority over decisions on refugee policy than over decisions on other aspects of immigration policy. So without strong congressional backing, it's very difficult to move ahead in new ways on refugee issues, although the president almost always takes the first step in that process. And part of the reason for the need for congressional backing is that without appropriation of funds, very little can happen. Because, as I'll be mentioning, a lot of the ways in which the U.S. exercises its leadership is through its funding of the refugee system. And this is also an area where there's been substantial change over the last decade or so. It used to be if there was a crisis that occurred in between the appropriation cycles, the U.S. could easily get a supplemental appropriation to fund whatever it would be committing to in the way of playing a leadership role. Because of the way in which the budget develops now and the fact that we're continually in crisis on budget, as we are right now, we're moving into, getting supplemental appropriations are extremely difficult. So we're not quite as nimble anymore, although I'll mention a couple of ways in which we are. The ways in which the sources and the instruments of U.S. leadership have, at the earliest period, it was with its very large resettlement program, and I'll talk more about each of these ways in which the U.S. has exercised its leadership. But from the time, certainly from post-World War II period, from the resettlement of displaced persons from Europe through subsequent crises, the U.S. resettlement of large numbers of refugees, usually in conjunction with Canada and Australia, has been a way of exercising leadership. The U.S. has also implemented innovative policies over the years. Some of these are quite positive, others are quite negative, but in both cases there tends to be other governments picking up on elements of these innovations. And I'll again talk a little bit more about some of those. The U.S. over the years has played an important diplomatic role in negotiating agreements, things like the Comprehensive Plan of Action on Indo-Chinese refugees, at both the 1979 original agreement on trade-off between maintaining first asylum and resettlement, as well as departures from the countries of origin, and then the 1989 comprehensive plan to try to bring the system to an end. A fourth way in which the U.S. exercises its power, as I mentioned, is in its financing of humanitarian organizations as well as NGOs working in this space. And then, in mostly exceptions, the U.S. ability to deploy U.S. military resources when needed to address humanitarian crises, including situations involving refugees and IDPs, has been a factor that, again, has some positive elements and also some negative elements in terms of the impact of that exercise of U.S. leadership. But certainly no other single country has had the ability to deploy those forces as quickly and in as great, with such great strength as the United States. Now, in my paper, I'm doing a bit on both the legal frameworks as well as in the future slide on the historical background to this. But we have a number of different laws that support the exercise of leadership and influence. On the financing of refugee operations, the Migration and Refugee Assistance Act of 1962 has been very important because it establishes not only the normal way in which the U.S. funds refugee programs, but also an emergency migration and refugee account, which is usually funded at about $50 million, sometimes more, sometimes less, and that through which the U.S. can respond pretty quickly in providing funding, albeit not in the amounts that may eventually be needed, in which a regular appropriation would be needed. The Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 is also important because of what's referred to as the notwithstanding clause, that basically says that certain forms of assistance, and particularly those related to humanitarian aid, can be allocated and used notwithstanding any other provision of law that might make it impossible to use the funds in those places. So the U.S. can fund a humanitarian emergency in places where there are otherwise economic sanctions and no use of U.S. funding. Other countries have the same provision, but it allows the U.S. to take leadership even in places where we're not particularly friendly with the powers that be in those areas. As I mentioned, the refugee resettlement has been important, so is asylum. The Refugee Act of 1980 is what is the basis for that set of policies. In the Immigration Act of 1990, in recognition that the refugee definition following the 51 Convention is very persecution-oriented, TPS allows for providing a temporary status for people fleeing conflict and fleeing natural disasters. And then after the U.S. Ratified the Convention Against Torture in 1998, we adopted legislation that allows for the implementation of that law. And almost always now, when someone applies for asylum, they're also applying for protection under the Convention Against Torture. The history of U.S. Refugee policies is fraught with both positive and negative examples, but until 1919, there was no special reference to refugees in U.S. law, but under the 1917 Literacy Act, there's a special exemption for refugees in some of the language requirements. Notwithstanding that, though, the 1930s showed eminent failure, and I would say the Avion Conference that was U.S. called, convened governments to talk about sort of solving the problem of refugees from Nazi Germany, and then the president announced right before the conference, or inviting countries to the conference, that there was no expectation of any changes in anyone's immigration policy, let alone the U.S. immigration policy, and anything that would be done would be done within the confines of what, at least for us, was a highly restrictive policy. And that ended up really causing complete failure of the convention, of the conference, and then U.S. policy more or less blocked admissions. I won't go through the rest of the history on that, but nor will I go through a lot of the things that I plan to refer to in the paper with regard to the Refugee Act. I'm not even going to try to go through the shifting origins of the resettlement program. But we'll make the case that the U.S. is resettling about 70% of all refugees. We're currently have been resettling at 70,000 per year. It's going up to 85,000 with the increased numbers for Syrian refugees and others. But that's at a low level relative to what we were doing in the late 70s, early 80s, when it was more in the 230,000 range on that. So we're not at the highs asylum, our system is very similar to those of other countries in the way in which we've operated. It's a very complicated system. We had been providing something of a model, which I'll mention a little bit later, in balancing an expedited system with a fair system, but now that system has become so backlogged that it's neither expeditious nor is it fair to those with good claims to refugee status. We've backtracked. Temporary protection status is completely discretionary, but it applies to a much wider set of life-threatening circumstances than the refugee definition does. But there are relatively few rights, other than work authorization, that accrues to those granted temporary protected status. The main problem with it is that it never ends. People who were affected by Hurricane Mitch in 1998 still have temporary protected status. There's no mechanism for adjusting to permanent residence, and that's rather difficult on that. But it has been used for a wide range of countries in different circumstances. The U.S. has recently taken on leadership on the issue of migrants in countries in crisis, which Megan mentioned. Again, it's part of the leadership has been in identifying populations that aren't covered by the traditional refugee regime and trying to figure out alternatives for dealing with these populations. There is strong support for the international humanitarian system. Two agencies involved, the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, the State Department, works almost completely through multilateral donations to multilateral organizations. The Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which works primarily with internally displaced persons, deals much more on a bilateral basis and with NGOs. In that. The financing goal is pretty clear when you see a chart of this sort. in terms of, cumulatively, the European Union is a strong supporter, but as a single country in terms of of the U.S. contributions, it's really quite impressive in terms of just how much beyond that other countries U.S. provides in absolute numbers relative to population. Doesn't look quite as good, but it still does. So let me come to assessment of the U.S. leadership. On resettlement, I think we do continue to play a strong leadership role, although not as much as has been the case when we've had more flexibility. The things that have limited are both the financing in terms of appropriation of funds, but even more so the security considerations since 9/11 that have made it almost impossible to act quickly in resettling people, and a major problem. TPS, as I mentioned, offers protection for those who don't meet the refugee definition, but it has its problems. But it has been a model that other countries have taken up in terms of ways of providing some level of protection from at least a non-refoulement standard for people from other life-threatening situations. Silent positive on non-state actors, problematic in terms of the way in which it's operating. Didn't mention previously interdiction and detention of asylum seekers is a very negative role that the U.S. pioneered, and one that, unfortunately, as we'll be hearing, Australia has moved very, very fully into the same line. Migrants and pensions in crisis, I think, positive on that. Sheer size of contributions keeps the U.S. in a leadership role. And much of the funding, as I mentioned, is through my multilaterals. I think that I would summarize at the international governance level that the UN can wield a pretty effective veto power over actions, but doesn't necessarily have the capacity to make changes that are in agreement with U.S. priorities. So it can stop action just through its financing usually, but not necessarily make action happen on that. So my summary conclusion then is that the U.S., in my judgment, and of course from the U.S., is still the most influential member of the refugee regime. It's judged by all of these factors that I've mentioned. But unlike in other policy areas where I think the U.S. can be roundly criticized, the U.S., I think, official policy actually prefers to operate through multilateral arrangements, that the hegemonic power is not necessarily what the U.S. seeks in this realm, particularly not in terms of the way in which the State Department operates in this. And then, as a result, having an array of other prominent actors, European Union, our resettlement partners, Canada, Australia, doing things collaboratively with those actors is actually a part of U.S. policy, not a threat to it.